We peel back the marble veneer of history to journey into a world that flourished in the very heart of the mightiest empire ever known. It's a world that existed in plain sight, yet has been shrouded in whispers and shame for 2 millennia. Picture ancient Rome. We see the Grand Colosseum, its arches echoing with the roar of the crowd. We imagine noble senators in pristine white togas, their voices shaping the destiny of civilization in the Forum. We see legions marching, their standards gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. This is the Rome of legend, the Rome of our history books. But beneath the golden statues and triumphant arches, a different empire operated, an economic and social powerhouse built on the bodies of women. In the bustling metropolis of Rome, it's estimated that nearly 1 in every 15 women sold intimacy to survive, to thrive, or simply to see the next sunrise. That's a city within the city, an army of over 45,000 women whose lives were governed by a completely different set of rules. But here is where the story truly begins, and where everything you think you know will be challenged. These women were not a monolith of suffering. They were not all desperate souls huddled in darkened alleyways. Some commanded fortunes that would make our modern celebrities blush, living in opulent villas and advising the most powerful men in the world. Others were trapped in conditions so unimaginably brutal that a quick death would have been a profound act of mercy. We will walk their streets. We will enter their homes, from the lavish to the horrific. We will decipher the economic empire they helped build and uncover the complex legal codes that both protected. We will meet real women with names, with dreams, with strategies of survival so ingenious they defy belief. Their stories are not just about sex. They are about power, intellect, entrepreneurship, and the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. Before we step through the looking glass, if you believe that the untold stories are the ones most worth telling, then join our community of history explorers by hitting that subscribe button. Become part of the journey into the past's most fascinating and forgotten corners. And if you find yourself captivated by the truths we uncover tonight, show your support with a like. I'm genuinely curious. What is the one image that comes to your mind when you think of ancient Rome? A grand aqueduct? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to see what picture of Rome we can paint together. Find a comfortable spot and let's travel back 2,000 years. The secrets of the eternal city are waiting. When we conjure an image of ancient Rome, it's often sanitized by Hollywood. We see gleaming marble, heroic figures, and a sense of order. But the reality was far grittier, far more chaotic, and infinitely more human. The Rome I want to show you tonight was a sensory overload. Its streets were a chaotic symphony of sounds, from the clatter of chariot wheels on cobblestone to the haggling of a dozen different languages in the marketplace. And the smells, a potent cocktail of fragrant spices, cheap wine, and the ever-present, pungent aroma human life lived in close quarters, a mix of sweat, refuse, and the sharp scent of fish sauce, or garum, that the Romans put on everything. In this city of staggering contrasts, the wealthy lived in sprawling villas on the hills, literally looking down on the poor who were crammed into rickety, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae. Sex was bought and sold as casually as a loaf of bread or a jug of wine. Here's the first thing we must understand, and it's a concept that can be difficult for the modern mind to grasp. Prostitution wasn't merely legal in ancient Rome. It was considered an absolute social necessity. The Romans, for all their military might and engineering genius, were profoundly conservative when it came to their social structure. Headed by the paterfamilias, was the bedrock of the state. The chastity and fidelity of respectable wives, the matroni, was paramount to ensuring clear lines of inheritance and maintaining social order. They reasoned with a cold, clear logic. If men's powerful sexual appetites were not given a safe and regulated outlet, they would inevitably turn towards seducing the wives and daughters of their peers. This would lead to adultery, illegitimate children, and the unraveling of the entire social fabric. Prostitutes weren't seen as a moral failing, but as a crucial pillar of social stability. They were a firewall, protecting the virtue of respectable women. Because of this, the Romans didn't just tolerate sex work. They organized it, they regulated it, and they taxed it, building an astonishingly complex infrastructure around it. Think of it not as a sin, but as the world's oldest regulated utility, as vital to the city's functioning as the aqueducts that brought it water. But to speak of prostitution in Rome as a single entity is to misunderstand it completely. It was not one profession. It was a dizzying, rigidly stratified pyramid, with a dozen different levels, each with its own culture, its own clientele, its own price point, and its own daily reality. The gap between a woman at the top of this pyramid and a woman at the bottom was as vast as the gap between an emperor and a slave. They might have lived within a few blocks of each other, but they inhabited entirely different universes. At the glittering apex of this hierarchy were women who were the ancient equivalent of a mind-bending fusion between a high society escort, a tenured university professor, and a celebrated performance artist. These women could recite epic poetry from memory, debate philosophy with learned scholars, play multiple musical instruments, and offer political counsel that could influence the decisions of senators. They lived in mansions decorated with imported silks and intricate mosaics. They owned businesses, managed vast sums of money, and were celebrities in their own right. You had a thriving middle class of sex workers. These were women who worked in established, state-licensed brothels or popular taverns. They had regular clients, a degree of stability, and lives that, while difficult, were not entirely devoid of agency or comfort. At the base of the pyramid were women who were, in the most literal sense, chained to their work. They lived and serviced their clients in tiny subterranean cells, often no bigger than a modern closet. Their existence a relentless cycle of exploitation and survival. The contrast was so stark, so extreme, it challenges our very notions of a single profession. What is most astonishing to me is how openly the Romans documented all of this. They were not a people given to shame or prudishness about the mechanics of their society. Archaeologists in Pompeii have unearthed a treasure trove of evidence. They found brothels with detailed, explicit frescoes above the doorways, acting as a visual menu of services for a multilingual, often illiterate clientele. The walls are covered in it. Scratched into the plaster are messages from clients, functioning like the world's first Yelp reviews. And he had the best time with Felicia. Amaryllis gives the best service for 2 asses. Satisfied declaration. Solemns, you are divine. These were not shameful, hidden acts. They were a recorded, rated, and routine part of daily Roman life, as public as a post on social media today. And here lies one of the most profound contradictions. While the Romans were remarkably open about the mechanics of prostitution, they were intensely conservative about other facets of sexuality. A respectable Roman wife was expected to be a model of modesty and virtue, almost invisible in public life. Her world was a home. A successful prostitute could be the most educated, articulate, and worldly woman in the entire neighborhood, a public figure of renown and influence. The society was a tapestry of such contradictions. Tonight, however, is not just about the system. It's about the women themselves. Real women with names that have echoed down through history, like the brilliant Cytheris, who began her life as a slave in a brothel but became so accomplished in arts and letters that she rose to become the cherished mistress of Mark Antony himself, before he was famously ensnared by Cleopatra. And it's also about the women whose names we will never know, who left behind only a single, poignant line of graffiti expressing a hope for freedom or a desperate love for a child they were forced to abandon. What I find most remarkable is that in a world that granted them almost no legal rights and viewed them as property, so many of these women found ways to seize real power. They became trusted confidants to powerful politicians, financial advisors to wealthy merchants, and in some cases, wildly successful entrepreneurs in their own right. They learned to navigate a system designed from the ground up to exploit them and, in many cases, found a way to turn that very system to their own advantage. As we delve deeper into their world, you will discover that these women were rarely the one-dimensional victims we might imagine, nor were they the empowered feminist icons that some modern narratives might suggest. Truth, as it so often is far more complex and far more interesting. They were survivors. They were strategists. They were human beings operating within one of history's most fascinating, brutal, and contradictory societies. You are about to hear stories that will range from the utterly heartbreaking to profoundly inspiring. We will explore how a single day in a woman's life could include a literary debate with Senator in the morning and a life-threatening encounter with violent, drunken soldier in the evening. We will uncover the economic realities that allowed some prostitutes to become wealthier than the merchants they served while others starved. We will see how their stories illuminate not just the forgotten corners of ancient Rome, but the timeless truths of human nature itself, our infinite capacity for both cruelty and kindness, for exploitation and empowerment, for survival and, ultimately, for transformation. So settle in, because our journey is about to begin. We are about to walk the narrow, winding streets of Subura, Rome's most notorious neighborhood, where marble facades had stories that were sometimes beautiful, often brutal, and always close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing at the edge of Subura, Rome's most infamous and vibrant district. the first thing that strikes you isn't a sight. It's a thick, almost tangible haze in the air, a complex mixture of unwashed bodies, the sweet smoke from countless burning oil lamps, the sour tang of cheap wine spilled on cobblestones, and the powerful, salty aroma of fermenting fish sauce. This is a raw, unfiltered scent of life. This is not the Rome of pristine temples and manicured gardens. This is the city's beating, bleeding heart, where survival was an art form and the night belonged to a different kind of Roman. The Suburra was nestled in a valley between several of Rome's famous hills. It was a chaotic but largely respectable commercial district. Merchants hawked their wares from open-fronted shops, selling everything from exotic spices that had traveled the Silk Road to locally crafted pottery and textiles. Respectable citizens would come here to shop and do business. But as the sun began its descent, casting long, deep shadows that crept across the narrow, a breathtaking transformation would occur, one that would make Jekyll and Hyde seem like a subtle character shift. The daytime merchants would hastily pack up their goods, bolt their heavy wooden shutters, and retreat to the safety of their homes in more sedate neighborhoods. And then, as if on cue, the night shift began. Picture yourself walking these streets as darkness descends. The buildings loom over you, some soaring to 5 or even 6 stories high. Ancient skyscrapers that were a marvel of engineering and a testament to overcrowding. These were the insulae, the apartment blocks of the common Roman. Don't imagine sturdy, elegant structures. Most were hastily built from timber and cheap brick, notoriously unstable, prone to fire, and sometimes they would simply collapse without warning. The wealthy Romans who named them insulae, which literally means islands, saw them as just that, isolated islands adrift in a sea of poverty and desperation. Yet, it's on the ground floors of these very buildings that some of the most sophisticated businesses in Rome operated. These were the lupaneria, and far from being hidden hovels, they were often architectural marvels of efficiency and commerce. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Pompeii, they discovered one of the most famous lupaneria preserved almost perfectly by the volcanic ash. It had 10 small rooms, or celli, each one just wide enough for a narrow, built-in masonry bed. But here is the detail that sends a shiver down your spine every time. Above the doorway to each cell was a small, explicit fresco. These paintings depicted in clear and artistic detail the specific sexual services or positions available with the woman inside. Crude vandalism. It was sophisticated, commissioned artwork. It was a visual menu, brilliantly designed for an international port city, where a client might be a soldier from Gaul, a sailor from Egypt, or a merchant from Syria, none of whom might speak Latin. It was a universal language of commerce. The floors inside were made of stone, not wood, and there's a heartbreakingly practical reason for this. Stone was far easier to wash down and disinfect. Contrary to popular belief, had a rudimentary but effective understanding of hygiene and disease transmission. They knew that in these crowded, intimate quarters, cleanliness could be the difference between profit and plague, between life and death. Each tiny room also had a small window set high in the wall, not for a romantic view, but for the grim necessity of ventilation. These women were working in what were essentially stone boxes, but every architectural detail was ruthlessly designed for the brutal efficiency of their trade. But the Suburra was more than just its brothels. The entire neighborhood was a thriving ecosystem built around the night economy. There were countless taverns or carponi, where watered-down wine flowed freely and dice games clattered on wooden tables late into the night. Conversations buzzed in a dozen different languages. You would find Roman soldiers on leave, their armor unbuckled. You'd see foreign merchants celebrating a successful, freed slaves enjoying their newfound and precarious liberty, even the occasional disguised senator or wealthy equestrian, seeking a few hours of anonymity and adventure far from his respectable life. Must have been staggering. Imagine the cacophony, raucous laughter spilling from tavern doorways, the shouts of street vendors selling late-night snacks, the melancholic strains of flute played by a street musician hoping for a few coins, and underneath it all, the constant, low murmur of commerce, a negotiation, a proposition, of transaction. This was not a silent, shameful world relegated to the shadows. This was Rome's nightlife, as open, vibrant, and bustling as any modern entertainment district, and the architecture held its own secrets. Many of these tenement buildings were constructed around a central. Archaeologists have found evidence that these spaces offered a brief respite for the women. There might be a small fountain, a few potted plants, or even an informal market where the women could trade personal items, food, or information. These weren't just workplaces. They were communities, however flawed and dangerous. The streets themselves tell a story of survival. They were notoriously narrow, twisting, and confusing, following no logical grid pattern. This wasn't just poor urban planning. It was a defensive feature. The maze-like layout offered protection and privacy. If the city guard decided to conduct a raid, or if rival gangs started trouble, the labyrinth of alleys and passages provided dozens of escape routes and hiding places. The very geography of the neighborhood was designed around evading authority and surviving danger. And then there were the signs, the graffiti that served as the Subura's own social media platform. The walls were the neighborhood's living newspaper. Felix was here with Fortunata. She's the best. Another serves as a public service announcement. Steer clear the tavern owned by his wine is poison, is a public shaming of a bad debt. Marcus owes me 3 denarii for last week. These walls were covered in reviews, warnings, love notes, business disputes, and personal messages that give us an incredibly intimate glimpse into the pulse of daily life. The lighting, or lack thereof, created the atmosphere. Flickering oil lamps and smoky torches cast a dreamlike, uncertain glow. But we shouldn't romanticize it. Oil was expensive, so most areas were only dimly lit. The shadows were deep, numerous, and they concealed both clandestine romance and sudden, brutal violence in equal measure. A woman in one room might be entertaining a gentle poet, composing verses with him, while her neighbor in the next cell fought for her life against a drunken soldier who refused to take no for an answer. What is so stunning is how the Romans normalized all of this through their urban planning. It wasn't an isolated ghetto on the outskirts of the city. In the very heart of Rome, a short walk from the Forum, the Senate House, and the major temples. The message this sent was unmistakable. This world, this economy, this part of life is an integral part of our society, not something to be hidden or ashamed of. It was woven into the very fabric of the city. Perhaps the most remarkable function of the Subura, however, was as a brutal but effective social safety net for women with nowhere else to turn. Runaway slaves, widows from distant wars, daughters of families too poor to afford a dowry. This neighborhood was a last resort. The conditions were often horrific. They were still preferable to starving on the streets or being condemned to the living death of the mines. The neighborhood offered not just a path to survival, but for the clever, the strong, or the lucky, it sometimes offered a path to opportunity. As the first light of dawn would begin to pierce the Roman sky, the Subura would slowly shed its nighttime skin. The night workers would retreat to their shared rooms to sleep, the taverns would fall silent, and the respectable daytime merchants would return to unbolt their shutters. It was like watching a city perform a daily costume change, preparing for an entirely different play. But the women who called this place home had to live in both worlds, thriving nighttime economy in the harsh, judgmental light of Roman social reality. Understanding how they navigated their lives between these two worlds reveals something profound about human adaptability, and the extraordinary lengths people will go to not just to survive, but to find dignity, community, and even power in the most unlikely of circumstances. Now that you've seen the stage, you're ready to meet the players. Because you're about to discover that the hierarchy within this world was so rigid and so complex. It determined everything from what a woman ate for breakfast to whether she would live to see her next birthday. The social pyramid of Roman sex work was so extreme, so meticulously structured, that women at different levels might as well have been living on different continents. We're talking about a system where one woman could own a villa with heated floors and a private library, while another woman, just a few streets away, slept on a lice-infested straw pallet in a stone cell smaller than a modern bathroom. The Romans didn't just tolerate their sex trade. They organized it with the same ruthless efficiency they applied to their legions, turning it into the world's first stratified service industry. Let me paint you a picture that will shatter any monolithic. At the very pinnacle of this pyramid sat a class of women known as the delicati, literally the delicate ones, or by the more famous Greek term, hetairai. These women were not prostitutes in the common sense. They were living, breathing works of art. To even get an appointment with one was a mark of supreme status. Think of them as a fusion of a Nobel laureate, a Broadway star, and a high-end therapist, all wrapped in one exquisitely sophisticated package. A delicata might charge for a single evening the equivalent of what a skilled legionary earned in an entire year. And the elite men of Rome, senators, generals, wealthy merchants, would literally compete, sometimes bidding against each other for the privilege of her company. These elite women lived in a style that would make modern influencers weep with envy. Archaeological evidence from the grandeur homes in Pompeii and Herculaneum, identified as courtesans' residences, shows us what their world was like. We see intricate mosaic floors depicting scenes from mythology, private gardens with bubbling fountains, and even private bathing complexes with running hot and cold water. One excavated courtesan's house in Pompeii contained a private library with niches for over 200 scrolls. That's a personal university in your home when the vast majority of the population was illiterate. But here's what truly set your mind spinning. These top-tier women were rarely selling just sex. They were selling an entire lifestyle experience, an aspirational package of culture and refinement. A wealthy Roman didn't visit a delicata merely for physical release. He went for intellectual stimulation, for cultural education, for sparkling conversation, and for a level of social and emotional intelligence that his own wife, bound by the strict and stifling conventions of a Roman matron, was simply not expected or allowed to provide. Women could debate the philosophies of Stoicism and Epicureanism, recite Greek poetry in the original language, discuss the latest military campaigns with tactical insight, engage in a witty, razor-sharp political banter that Roman elite society absolutely adored. They were the ultimate status symbol. Let's descend just one level in this hierarchy, and we encounter the meretresses. These were professional, registered courtesans who operated more like what we might recognize as high-end escorts today. These women were businesswomen. They typically had their own apartments or small houses, often in respectable neighborhoods, and maintained something resembling regular business hours. A meretrix would cultivate a list of regular, wealthy clients, perhaps seeing 3 to 5 men per week. The fees were substantial, enough to keep her comfortably housed, fed, and clothed in fine wool and linen, perhaps with some simple gold jewelry. She couldn't afford a villa with a private library, but she could afford a life of relative independence and security. The meretresses developed fascinating and diverse business strategies to survive and thrive. Many specialized. Some became renowned for their skills in conversation and companionship, offering what were essentially ancient therapy sessions for men burdened by the immense pressures of Roman public life. Others carved out a niche as party planners, known for their ability to organize lavish and entertaining dinner parties or convivia. They would hire the musicians, select the menu, and provide the witty conversation that made the event a success. Some even functioned as informal financial agents, lending money to their clients at interest, holding valuables for safekeeping, or using their network of contacts to facilitate business deals. They were savvy entrepreneurs who turned their social position into a portfolio of diversified income streams. We descend into the middle of the pyramid, and the world gets significantly darker and more. Here we find the prostibuli, the women who worked in the established brothels, under the tight control of an owner, known as a leno for a man or a lena for a woman. These were essentially pimps who owned the establishment and, in many cases, the women themselves, if they were slaves. A prostibula might see 10 to 20 clients in a single day, a grueling, relentless schedule. Her earnings were barely enough to cover the fees she owed the leno for her food, her cell-like room, and a small. These women lived in the upper floors of the brothels we visited in the Suburra, sharing cramped, unsanitary quarters with several other women. The life of a prostibula was a constant, exhausting balancing act that required incredible psychological fortitude. She had to appear willing, engaging, and even enthusiastic for a relentless stream of anonymous men, all while building an internal wall to protect herself from the brutal, dehumanizing reality of her situation. They developed elaborate mental survival techniques, creating fictional personas to inhabit during work, practicing a form of mental detachment, or forming intensely loyal and supportive bonds with the other women, creating informal therapy networks to cope with the daily trauma. And then we reach the bottom. At the absolute base of this crushing hierarchy were the lupi, literally the she-wolves. This is where the English word lupaner, or brothel, the name itself tells you everything you need to know about how Roman society viewed them, not as human women, but as predatory, feral animals howling for their prey in the dark. These were the women who worked the streets, the dark arches of the Circus Maximus, the city's graveyards, and the absolute cheapest, filthiest brothels. A lupa might service upwards of 20 for prices so low they barely covered the cost of a single meager meal. Her clients were the poorest laborers, sailors, and slaves. What's truly heartbreaking is that the ranks of the lupi were often filled with women who had fallen from the higher levels of the hierarchy, a meretrix who grew too old, who contracted a disfiguring disease, or who simply developed a reputation for being difficult, could find herself cast out with no choice but to descend into the brutal world of street-level work. The Roman system was unsentimental and merciless. It showed no pity for women, who could no longer maintain their market value. This hierarchy wasn't just about money or social status. It was a matter of life and death. It determined your legal standing, your personal safety, and your claim to basic human dignity. A delicata who was mistreated by a powerful client could appeal to her other wealthy patrons for protection, or even seek recourse in courts. A lupa who was beaten or raped by a client had no recourse at all. The higher you were in the system, the more you were recognized as a person in the eyes of Roman law and society. The Romans even visually enforced this hierarchy through a color-coded system of dress. Elite courtesans were famous for their flamboyant and expensive attire. They could wear vibrant colors like purple and saffron, fine silks, and glittering gold jewelry, things forbidden to respectable matrons. Mid-level workers wore simpler tunics in earth tones. The women at the bottom were often required by law to wear a specific, garish flame-colored or yellow toga. It was a badge of shame, a uniform that immediately identified their profession and their lowly status to everyone they encountered. What fascinates historians is how this hierarchy, while brutally oppressive, also created its own intricate microeconomy and social world. Women at different levels rarely socialized, but they were all part of an interconnected system. An elite courtesan might employ lower-level women, aides, or assistants. Mid-level workers in the same tavern might pool their resources or form informal partnerships for safety. And even the lupi on the streets developed tight-knit networks of mutual support, sharing information, food, and protection to survive the harshest conditions. The psychological impact of this system was profound. It was a brilliant and diabolical form of social control that often made women their own enforcers. A successful meretrix might look down on a common prostibula with the same condescending disdain that a respectable Roman wife showed towards all sex workers. By creating these internal divisions, the system effectively prevented women from uniting against the overarching structure that exploited them all. But perhaps most remarkably, this hierarchy was not entirely static. While incredibly difficult, movement was possible. A clever and disciplined lupa could save a minuscule amount of money, perhaps enough to buy her freedom if she were a slave, and set herself up as a low-level independent worker. A beautiful and talented prostibula in a brothel might catch the eye of a single wealthy patron who could elevate her to the status of his private mistress, effectively making her a courtesan. The system was designed to be a prison, but it wasn't completely inescapable. Understanding this pyramid is the key to unlocking the rest of this world. It explains the different strategies, the different skills, and the different forms of psychological armor these women needed to navigate their daily lives. Now that you understand the ladder they were either climbing or falling down, you are ready to step into the private world of those who reach the very top. Because the daily life of a high-end Roman courtesan was so extraordinary, so filled with luxury, learning, and genuine power, that it defies every stereotype and challenges everything we think we know about the lives of women in the ancient world. The daily life of a woman at the bottom of Rome's sexual hierarchy was a world away from the perfumed villas of the elite. Let's call her Flavia. Her name is lost to history, like the names of tens of thousands of others. But through the fragments left behind, a line of graffiti, an accounting shard from a brothel, a dry legal text, we can piece together the stark, brutal rhythm of her existence. And what we find is both horrifying and surprisingly complex. Flavia's day begins before the sun has even risen, not in a sun-dappled bedroom, but in a windowless, stone-walled room, a cella that is exactly 7 Roman feet long and 4 feet wide. We know these dimensions with such precision because Roman architects, in their obsessive drive for uniformity, built brothels with standardized, ruthlessly efficient designs. The air is cold and damp, the stone walls weeping with condensation. The only furnishing is a narrow, built-in masonry bed, covered with a straw-stuffed mattress that she has to share with a woman who worked the night before her. There is no privacy. There are no personal belongings, save for the clothes on her back. There are certainly no silk curtains or bowls of imported figs. Her alarm clock is not the gentle song of a bird, but the harsh, scraping sound of the city's public slaves cleaning the streets outside. They sluice the cobblestones with buckets of water and scrub them with stiff brooms. This small detail is important because it reminds us that even the lowest-tier sex worker was an integral part of Rome's meticulous urban rhythm. The city ran on a schedule, and everyone from the consuls in the Senate to the prostitutes in the Suburra lived. Flavia's first task of the day is not her own. It's a task that reveals the cold, business-like efficiency of Roman brothel management. Not just herself, but her workspace, her cell, The stone floors had to be scrubbed down, often with a mixture of water and vinegar. Vinegar was one of the few readily available and effective antiseptics of the ancient world. Understood that disease was bad for business. An outbreak of scabies or venereal disease could shut down his entire operation. So, this forced cleanliness wasn't about providing dignity for the women. It was about protecting the owner's financial investment. Flavia would spend the first hour of her day on her hands and knees, preparing the room for the day's grim business. If you could call it that, would be whatever scraps were left over from the tavern that was often attached to the brothel. This usually meant bread, so stale and hard had to be soaked in watered-down wine to be edible, accompanied by a few wrinkled olives or a chunk of cheap. But here's a fascinating detail. Even this meager meal was steeped in Roman custom, would have been made in the traditional way, however diluted, would still be mixed with water according to proper Roman proportions. Even in the deepest pits of poverty and exploitation, the cultural DNA of Rome persisted. Around midday, as respectable Romans were enjoying their lunch and preparing for their afternoon nap or siesta, Flavia's real workday would begin. And it's here that the historical record, particularly the graffiti from Pompeii, gets chillingly specific. The evidence suggests that a street-level or low-tier brothel prostitute would typically service between 15 and 25 clients per day. That's a new client roughly every 30 minutes during the peak afternoon and evening hours. Standardized and sometimes even posted on the wall, 2 asses of very small denomination of bronze coin was a going rate for basic services. This was roughly what a common laborer might earn for a few hours of hard work. But to see these transactions as merely mechanical is to miss the incredible survival strategies these women developed. These were skills that were, in their own way, just as sophisticated as the philosophical debates held by the elite courtesans. They created their own coded languages, a slang incomprehensible to outsiders, to warn each other about dangerous clients. A certain phrase shouted down the hall could mean, "This man is violent," while a different one might mean, "This one is a soldier who won't pay." They created informal intelligence networks, sharing information about which legion had just been paid, which sailors were known to be generous, and which local thugs were best to be avoided. They even had their own systems of folk medicine, sharing knowledge passed down through generations about herbal remedies for preventing pregnancy, inducing menstruation, or treating the symptoms of common diseases. They were their own doctors, their own security, and their own union. The afternoon heat in Rome, especially in the cramped, airless confines of Subura, where the stone buildings trapped heat, but Flavia could not rest. Roman working hours were dictated by the movement of the sun, and the brothels operated on a schedule as rigid as any modern factory. Peak hours were from noon until just after dusk, the time when soldiers were released from their duties, laborers finished their work, and men from all walks of life sought entertainment. And here is something that will break your heart. Despite these dehumanizing conditions, the women desperately held on to small rituals of dignity, and in the ruins of these brothels, archaeologists have found tiny, hidden personal altars. They've discovered miniature shrines to household gods, the Lars and Penates, tucked away under a loose floorboard or hidden in a small crevice in the wall. A woman like Flavia, who officially had nothing, still found a way to practice her religious beliefs, to maintain some small, secret connection to her ancestors, her past, and her own humanity. The evening brought a new kind of challenge. As the taverns filled up and the wine flowed more freely, the clients became more drunk, more unpredictable, and more violent. Violence was a constant, daily threat, and for a woman in Flavia's position, there was no real legal protection. If a client beat her, there was no authority she could appeal to. But this is where the community aspect of these establishments became a matter of life and death. The women developed elaborate systems of mutual protection. A specific whistle pattern might be a cry for help. Certain phrases shouted loud enough were a code for a called bouncer, "We need to get this man out." They created their own security networks because Roman law offered them none. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Flavia's daily life was her economic situation. She was exploited, and if she was a slave, but even within that system, she still had to function as a micro-entrepreneur. She had to manage money, negotiate where she could, and try to plan for a future, however limited her options might be. Some women at this level, through incredible discipline, managed to save tiny amounts of money over years, would hide their coins, planning for a day when age or illness would inevitably force them out of the trade. It was a microscopic version of financial planning, but it shows that even in the most desperate of circumstances, human beings find ways to hope and strategize for the future. The night shift brought its own unique horrors and its own small mercies. The clients were fewer, often more dangerous, criminals using the cover of darkness, drunken men whose inhibitions were gone. But there were also occasionally moments of unexpected human connection. A client who was gentle and treated her like a person for a few minutes. A fellow worker who shared a piece of fruit she had managed to acquire. A shared joke or a moment of laughter in the hallway that made the crushing misery temporarily bearable. When it finally came in the early hours of the morning, was rarely deep or restful. The insulae were so poorly constructed that every sound echoed through the thin walls and floors. Every business transaction in the next room. Privacy was a luxury that simply did not exist at this level of Roman society. Even unconsciousness offered only a brief, partial escape from the grinding reality of daily survival. What is so extraordinary about women like Flavia is that they survived. They survived not just physically, which was an immense accomplishment in itself given the constant threats of violence, disease, and malnutrition. They survived psychologically. They did this by creating meaning, community, and dignity in circumstances designed to strip all of those things away. They formed families of choice with the other women in their brothel, creating bonds of loyalty and affection that were often stronger than blood. They maintained their religious practices, connecting them to something larger and more permanent than their immediate suffering. They found ways to laugh, to love, and to hope, even in the darkest and most desperate of conditions. The historical record of their lives is fragmentary, but what survives paints a picture of women of remarkable strength and resourcefulness. They had to be skilled negotiators, amateur psychologists, medical self-advocates, and financial managers, all while navigating society that viewed them as little more than human refuse. The very fact that they maintained any sense of self at all under these conditions is a testament to something incredible about the resilience of a human spirit. What if I told you that the pathways into Roman prostitution were so diverse, so complex, and so unexpected that they included everyone from kidnapped foreign princesses to ambitious farm girls seeking economic independence? The stories of how women ended up in this world will challenge every simple assumption you might have about ancient society and about the complex, often rational choices people made when their survival was on the line. Let's begin with perhaps the most shocking and counterintuitive reality. Not every woman in Roman sex work was a victim of coercion. I know that sounds impossible given the brutal realities we just explored, but the evidence is undeniable. Her story is preserved in a series of remarkably detailed legal documents from the 1st century, discovered in the dry sands of Egypt. Claudia was not a slave. She was a free-born woman, the daughter of free parents who owned a small olive grove outside of Rome. When a series of bad harvests and crushing debt threatened her family with complete ruin, at the age of 19, made a calculated economic decision. It's a decision that would horrify modern sensibilities, but made perfect, logical sense in the brutal economic landscape of ancient Rome. She voluntarily entered into a contract with a brothel owner in the Suburra. The contract, written on papyrus and preserved for 2,000 years, shows that she negotiated her own terms like a modern professional. She was not a slave, but an independent contractor. She agreed to work for a fixed term of 3 years. She would keep 30% of her direct earnings. Crucially, the brothel owner was contractually obligated to provide her with training in literacy and basic accounting. Her goal wasn't just to save her family from debt. Her goal was to accumulate enough capital to buy her own land and establish herself as an independent businesswoman. And here's the kicker. Tax records discovered from 3 years later show a woman named Claudia purchasing a small vineyard in her own name and registering herself as a wine merchant. She used the capital and the business skills she acquired in the brothel to launch a legitimate and successful enterprise. She went on to become one of the wealthiest women in her region, a respected landowner and employer. For Claudia, a voluntary, fixed-term entry into sex work was a strategic, if brutal, investment in her future, and it paid off spectacularly. But Claudia's story, while astonishing, represents just one pathway among dozens. The Roman Empire was a war machine, and its constant military campaigns across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East created a steady, tragic stream of captive women who were funneled into the sex trade through no choice of their own. Take the historical case of Berenice, a Jewish princess who was captured during the catastrophic Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The historian Josephus describes her and other high-status captives being paraded through the streets of Rome as part of the emperor's triumphal procession, a terrifying public spectacle designed to display Rome's power, not into simple slavery, but to a high-end brothel owner who specialized in providing exotic women for wealthy clients who harbored fantasies about bedding foreign royalty. Berenice's royal bearing, her education, and her foreign allure made her an incredibly valuable commodity, but surviving fragments of letters, believed to have been written by her, revealed profound psychological trauma of her experience. She wrote about the surreal horror of having to maintain her royal dignity and intellectual prowess while being treated as a piece of property. In a remarkable twist, also describes using her intimate political knowledge of the eastern provinces to provide valuable intelligence to her clients, Roman generals and politicians who were planning military campaigns in the region. Her tragic story reveals how the machinery of war created a pipeline of educated, high-status women whose skills and knowledge were then systematically exploited by the brothel owners. Then there was the vast category of debt slaves. Roman law was brutally clear on this point. If a family could not repay its debts, the creditors had the legal right to claim family members as payment. In a society that prized sons for carrying on a family name and performing military service, daughters were often the first to be sold. A legal document from Pompeii, a contract of sale, records a transaction of a 16-year-old girl. Her father sold her to a local brothel owner to cover his gambling debts, which totaled 200 denarii. The contract is chillingly specific. It states that Livia could, in theory, buy back her own freedom for double the original debt, but with interest accumulating daily and her earnings being controlled by the brothel owner, this was an almost impossible dream. These different backgrounds, free women making an economic choice captive, princesses and debt slaves, created distinct and fascinating subcultures within the world of Roman prostitution. Women who had been slaves before entering the trade brought with them hard-won survival skills and a deep understanding of how to navigate Rome's complex social hierarchies. The war captives often possessed education, multilingual skills, and cultural knowledge that made them extremely valuable as high-end courtesans. The debt slaves, tragically, often maintained connections to their families, who sometimes, in rare cases, managed to eventually buy them back. But perhaps the most complex and largest category of all were the liberti. These were former slaves who had been granted their freedom or had managed to purchase it. But freedom in Roman society without money, connections, or a male sponsor was a precarious and often terrifying state. Roman law severely restricted the occupations that freed women could enter. They couldn't become teachers in public schools, priestesses in the major state cults, or run many types of businesses without a male patron. Sex work was one of the few professions where a woman, especially a freed woman, could operate with a degree of independence and, if she was successful, accumulate real wealth. Aelia Fortunata is a perfect example of this group. Her tombstone, which she paid for herself, born a slave in a wealthy household. She was freed in her master's will, who also left her a small inheritance. But a small sum of money, recognizing her limited options, Aelia used her inheritance as startup capital. She established herself as a mid-level meretrix, specializing in providing services to wealthy merchants. Her literacy and her intimate knowledge of how a wealthy household was managed, skills she learned as a slave, made her particularly appealing to this clientele. Within 5 years, according to her tombstone inscription, she had saved enough money to purchase the freedom of her own sister and to establish a small business training other freed women who needed to become successful courtesans. She turned her freedom into a thriving enterprise. The economic calculations these women made reveal something profound about the harsh realities of Roman society. Sex work, despite its dangers and stigma, represented the best and sometimes the only available path to financial independence and social mobility. It was stigmatizing, but it was also one of very few avenues where a woman could earn and control her own capital and make her own independent business decisions. And here's something that might surprise you. Roman prostitution also included women who were essentially failed entrepreneurs from other fields. The Roman economy was volatile. A woman who had invested her family's money in a shipping venture could lose everything if the ship sank in a storm. A woman who ran a textile business could be ruined if a new trade route brought in cheaper foreign cloth. Rather than face complete destitution, some of these women would choose to enter sex work temporarily, using their business acumen to earn back their capital before attempting to relaunch their legitimate ventures. Legal records show several cases of women moving back and forth between respectable business and prostitution as their economic fortunes waxed and waned. The most heartbreaking category, however, were the abandoned children. Roman law gave fathers, the paterfamilias, the absolute right to expose unwanted infants, to simply leave them outside to die of exposure, or to be picked up by anyone who found them. Because sons were valued more highly, girls were abandoned far more frequently than boys. Many of these abandoned baby girls were collected by linons, the brothel owners, who then raised them specifically for a life in the sex trade. These women had no memory of any other life, no family connections, and no legal identity beyond their value as a sexual commodity. But even within this grim reality, they created their own forms of archaeological evidence, and written accounts suggest that women who had been raised in the brothels often became informal leaders, mothers to the younger newcomers, teaching them the survival skills they would need and maintaining the oral traditions and culture they're unique. They created family structures within the brothel that provided emotional support and practical protection that the outside world denied them. What's remarkable is how these diverse backgrounds directly influenced the services the women provided and the clients they attracted. A former household slave understood the domestic routines and social anxieties of the wealthy and could provide a form of companionship that felt familiar and comforting to an elite man. A war captive from Greece brought with her an exotic allure and skills in music, dance, or storytelling from her home culture. A freedwoman with business experience could offer practical financial advice and networking opportunities that her merchant clients genuinely valued. The Roman legal system, in its obsessive way, even recognized these distinctions, creating different categories of registration and taxation for different types of sex workers. It was a world of infinite complexity, where a woman's past didn't just haunt her, it defined her present and shaped her potential future. These weren't just victims or villains. They were human beings, making the best choices they could from a limited and often brutal menu of options, using every resource, every skill, and every ounce of courage they had to survive. Music swells slightly, then fades to a low hum for the conclusion. The stories of these women, etched in graffiti, preserved on papyrus, and buried under layers of history, are a powerful testament to the human spirit. They navigated a world of unimaginable complexity and contradiction, a world that both celebrated and condemned them, protected and exploited them. From the glittering heights of the courtesan's villa to the desperate depths of the streetwalker's cell, they were not passive figures in history. They were agents of their own lives as best they could be. They were strategists, survivors, entrepreneurs, and sometimes even lovers. Their world may seem distant, even alien, but the questions their lives raise are timeless. They force us to confront our own ideas about sexuality, power, economic justice, and the very nature of human dignity. The world of Roman prostitution, with its regulated trade and social complexities, eventually crumbled under the weight of a new Christian morality, an epical shift that would reshape Western civilization forever. The story of that transformation, and the incredible tale of the last Roman prostitute who became one of history's most powerful empresses, is a story for another time. What these women leave us with is a legacy of resilience. They remind us that history is not just made by emperors and generals in their marble halls. It is also made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, making difficult choices and finding ways to create meaning, community, and hope against all odds. Their voices, whispering to us across the centuries, remind us that every human story matters, and that even in the darkest corners of history, the light of the human spirit can never be completely extinguished. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most hidden worlds. The stories of these women have been buried for too long. Believe, as I do, that these forgotten histories deserve a voice. Help our community of explorers grow by hitting that subscribe button. And I have to ask, after hearing all of this, what was the one detail that surprised you the most? The Yelp reviews? The business-savvy courtesans? The legal contracts? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, remember that the past is never truly past, and it's filled with voices just waiting for us to listen.